Once the council broke up, the long hall emptied with frantic energy. The elders scattered into the night, departing for their respective clans to rouse every fighter, scout, and woodsman who could still wield a blade or draw a bowstring. Outside, the wind howled through the high crags, carrying with it an eerie feeling that something was about to happen. Things were finally in motion. From the western precipice, Tormund had delivered his promise. Rian had watched from a distance as the general loosed a single blazing fire arrow into the western sky. It had arched beautifully over the sky, a streak of brilliant crimson defiance that cut through the pale moonlight before plunging into the abyss. Within hours, the answering smoke of the Nostrudor vanguard began to rise from the lowlands. The men of the south were moving. In the quiet tension of a small stone armory, the only sounds were the heavy clinking of iron and the sharp tug of leather straps. Rian stood before a polished shield, his fingers clumsy as he tried to fasten the heavy pauldrons over his shoulders. The armor felt heavy, too heavy, as if the metal itself was protesting the coming slaughter. "It feels like we are always fighting," Rian muttered, his voice sounding small against the stone walls. He let his hands drop to his sides, exhaling a breath that trembled slightly. "From the moment I woke up in the city to the frosts and now here, does it ever stop? Is this all we are?" Adora walked up behind him, her movements fluid and practiced. She reached around his shoulders, her strong fingers effortlessly catching the leather strap he had been struggling with and pulling it tight until the iron settled correctly against his collarbone. "This is what you did before you were taken, Rian," she said softly. She stepped back, reaching for her own forearm guards and strapping them on with effortless precision. "It's not all you are, but it is what the world demanded of you." Rian turned to look at her, his brow furrowing. "Before, I was a prince. I thought I sat in halls and listened to old men argue." A faint, melancholic smile touched Adora's lips, though her eyes remained fiercely serious under the lantern light. "You never stayed in the halls for long. Whenever possible, you were out there. You were part of the raiding groups, the scouting missions along the lowlands, the front lines of the border skirmishes. You didn't just inherit a title, Rian. It's why everyone in these mountains looked up to you as a prince, because you were always willing to put your own life on the line for your people. You chose the dirt and the blood over the throne." She stepped closer, placing a hand on the center of his chest piece. "Just like your father, and just like your mother." The words hung in the air, sudden and sharp. Rian froze. The breath caught in his throat, and a cold, hollow sensation opened up in his chest. His mother. In all the chaos of his rewritten mind, in all the frantic searching through the broken fragments of his past, he had scrambled to find pieces of his father, of Hothan. But as Adora spoke the word, a devastating realization dawned on him. He had absolutely no idea who his mother was. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what she looked like, whether her eyes were dark like his, or if she shared his stubborn jaw. He didn't know if she had died in the same defense that broke his family, if she had succumbed to the harsh mountain winters, or if she was still out there somewhere, searching the ash for a son who wouldn't even recognize her face. "Adora," Rian whispered, his voice cracking as he looked at her, the sudden weight of the missing piece crushing his newfound resolve. "My mother, who was she?" Adora's expression softened, the fierce warrior mask slipping away to reveal an aching tenderness. She lowered her hand from his chest, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second on the cold iron of his armor. "Her name was Rihanna," Adora said softly, her voice carrying a quiet reverence. "And she was beautiful, Rian. Truly beautiful. Not just in her face, but in her spirit. She was just like your father in all the ways that mattered. Fierce, unyielding, and extremely protective of the clans, they were inseparable." She turned slightly, her gaze drifting toward the small high window of the armory, looking out into the dark mountain night as if she could see right through the stone to the past. "They died together," she continued, the words dropping heavily into the quiet room. "Defending the northern passes many years ago, they held the line so the rest of us could retreat into the higher caverns of the mountain. They fell side by side exactly as they lived." A small, genuine smile broke through Adora's solemn expression as a specific memory caught her. "When we were younger, before the world caught fire, she would sit on the lower terraces and just watch the two of us. We used to run rampant through the foothills, pretending to be great warriors of old. We'd scramble up the most dangerous jagged rocks we could find, completely reckless. Rihanna would just laugh. Your father would fret, but she would tell him that the blood of the mountain couldn't be kept on flat ground. She used to look at you with so much pride, Rianne. You had her laugh. Adora seemed to lose herself in the memory for a long moment, her eyes bright beneath the dim lantern light, completely transported back to a time of sunlit rocks and shared laughter. But Rianne remained frozen in the cold reality of the present. He listened to her words, desperately pleading with his own mind to spark, to flash, to give him even an echo of that laugh or a single brush of a mother's hand. But there was nothing. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where a mother's face should have been. To him, Rihanna wasn't a memory. She was a ghost story told by a friend. It was a terrifying reminder of just how much Zarek and the entity had truly stolen from him. Unable to bear the weight of the silence, Rianne turned away. He walked over to the wooden bench where his gear lay and reached down, his fingers wrapping around the familiar leather grip of his sword. He lifted the weapon, the weight of the steel comforting and grounding compared to the hollow pieces of his life. He didn't speak. He just stood there for a long time, holding the blade in both hands, his thumb slowly tracing the intricate, deeply carved sigil on the hilt. The cold metal pressed into his palms. It asked nothing of him. It didn't expect him to remember. It was simply there, solid and unchanging, in a life where almost everything else had been stolen. Adora did not interrupt his thoughts during this time. She stood quietly in the dim lantern light, watching the subtle shifts in his expression as he stared down at the sigil on his hilt. She could see the painful effort in his eyes, the silent struggle as he tried to force the fragments of a life he should have known to piece themselves back together. He deserved to know these things. He deserved to remember the mother who had loved him, the father who had trained him, and the sunlit days before the cold. She held on to the hope that it would all come back to him in time. But she knew his mind was a fractured mirror, and healing could not be rushed. Rianne broke the heavy silence. "You ready?" he asked her. Startled by his sudden readiness to continue and the abrupt shift in his demeanor, Adora looked around the stone armory, lost for a brief moment as she pulled herself out of the past. She blinked away the memories, shaking off the weight of the ghosts, before reaching down for a heavy leather quiver filled with arrows fitted with red-tipped feathers. She slung it expertly across her shoulders and took firm hold of her bowblade, the familiar grip bringing her back into sharp focus. "Always," she replied, her eyes locking onto his with fierce loyalty. "Are you Rianne?" Rianne slid his sword smoothly into its leather sheath, the steel hissing softly, before settling with a sharp click and tied the belt securely around his waist. "I have no idea," he said to her softly, stepping closer. "But as long as we stick together—" He let the promise hang in the air, a small, genuine smile breaking through the tension on his face. Seeing the resolve in his eyes, Adora felt the tight knot in her chest loosen just a fraction, and she offered him a warm smile in return. Whatever was waiting for them in the north, they would face it as one. The moment they stepped beyond the heavy stone threshold of the armory, the illusion of a quiet mountain night dissolved entirely. Mount Calem had thrown off its peaceful mantle, replaced by a roaring, rhythmic fury of a sanctuary preparing for war. Every terrace carved into the mountain's face was alive with the fierce, orange glow of wood fires, turning the slopes into a tiered cascade of light that defied the encroaching dark. Down in the lower rings, the steady, earth-shaking ring of iron striking iron echoed off the rock faces. Blacksmiths working in desperate, exhausting shifts through the night, their hammers falling like thunder as they repaired broken mail and forged the final lines of steel. The air above them was constantly fractured by the heavy beating of wings. From the freezing dark of the lowlands, scouts were returning to the high perches, their arms trembling as they carried exhausted hawks whose eyes had witnessed the march of the enemy. On the pathways, the youngest generation of the mountain moved with tireless purpose, weaving through the crowded terraces carrying heavy bundles of newly fletched arrows. Near the weapon racks, elderly elves, their hands gnarled like the roots of the ancient trees, and their eyes dimming with age, sat in quiet circles, painstakingly sharpening spearheads. They were too old to march, too fragile to stand on the front lines, but their wrists still bore the memory of steel's bite as they prepared the blades for those who would fight in their stead. From the deep crags and distant peaks, the low, mournful wail of horns began to echo through the valleys, answering Tormund's blazing signal. The mountain was waking up. The blood of Calum was flowing to the gates, and as Rian and Adora walked into the firelight, the roar of a people refusing to break rose to meet them. As they descended into the crowded artery of the main terrace, the sea of people parted before them. The roar of the preparation didn't cease, but it shifted. Heads turned as Rian passed. Blacksmiths paused their hammers, leaving them resting heavily on the anvils. Elders looked up from their sharpening stones, their dim eyes tracking his movement. And children carrying bundles of arrows stopped in their tracks, staring up at him with wide, unblinking wonder. In their expressions, there was no fear, only a profound, humbling reverence, and a desperate, burning love for the prince who had returned from the dead. Rian felt the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing against his chest-piece. He tried to nod, to offer a reassuring smile, to be the symbol they so clearly needed him to be. But his muscles felt rigid, his expressions forced. He was a fraud wearing a hero's skin. "They're looking at me like I'm a god," Rian muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed strictly on the path ahead to avoid meeting a particularly hopeful gaze from an old elf. "Or a ghost that's supposed to save them all. Adora, I don't know what to give them." Adora walked a half-step behind him, her hand resting casually near her bow blade, though her eyes scanned the crowd with a protective sharpness. "You don't have to give them a miracle, Rian," she said softly, her voice cutting through the nearby clang of metal. "Just give them your eyes. Look back at them. Before you were taken, you knew the name of almost every blacksmith's apprentice on this terrace. You don't need the names right now. Just don't look away." A young girl, barely tall enough to reach Rian's waist, darted out from the shadow of a tent, holding a small charm made of woven mountain grass and a single blue feather. She offered it up to him, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes shining with absolute faith. Rian froze. He looked at the charm, then at the girl, a suffocating panic rising in his throat. He couldn't remember her. He couldn't remember the logic behind the blue feather. Before the silence could stretch too long, Adora stepped forward smoothly. She knelt, bringing herself to the girl's eye level, and gently took the charm. "The blessing of the high winds," Adora said with a warm, brilliant smile. "He will wear it close to his heart, Lyra. Go on now, help your mother with the fletching." "Please come home," said Lyria. The girl beamed, nodding frantically before disappearing back into the crowd. Adora stood up and pressed the woven grass into Rian's armored palm. "Her name is Lyra," Rian whispered, his thumb brushing the rough grass. "You knew her." "We both did," Adora replied, her tone turning fiercely gentle as they continued walking. "She used to steal apples from the palace kitchens just to leave them outside your quarters. You caught her once, and instead of punishing her, you spent an hour teaching her how to juggle them." A bitter, melancholic smile touched Rian's lips. "I sound like a good man. I wish I could meet him." "He's not gone, Rian. He's just buried under the ice that the evil in the north left behind," Adora said, stepping closer so their shoulders brushed as they navigated past a roaring forge fire. "Every struggle you have right now, every bit of guilt you feel because you can't remember, that is him. A selfish prince wouldn't care that he forgot his people. You're bleeding for them internally, exactly the way you used to bleed for them on the borders." They reached the edge of the terrace, where the path narrowed and led toward the heavy, iron-reinforced gates of the mountain's primary entrance, the Pillar of Calum. Ahead the horns blew again, a low, vibrating note that shook the stone beneath their boots. Rian slipped the small grass charm securely beneath the strap of his chest-piece, right over his heart. He looked back one last time at the tiered fires of Mount Calum, and then turned to face the dark, howling wind of the northern passes. "Then let's go make sure they have a home to come back to," Rian said, his voice finally finding its footing, steady and resolute. Adora looked at him, the fierce, unyielding loyalty returning to her eyes. "Right behind you, Prince." The winding pathway finally terminated at the mountain's forward threshold. Rian stopped dead. Beyond the final archway, the mountain simply ended. Suspended over an abyss that swallowed the moonlight hung the Pillar of Calum. Even with his fractured memory, Rian felt a profound sense of awe catch in his throat. The pillar was a monumental feat of ancient engineering, a colossal, vertically oriented platform carved from the very stone of the mountain, reinforced with bands of blackened iron that gleamed faintly under the starlight. It was suspended over a breathtaking, dizzying abyss by massive, groaning chains, each link thicker than a man's torso. This structure was the sole artery of Mount Calum, the only way in or out of the mountain's high sanctuary, capable of lowering a dozen fully armored warriors into the lowlands at a time. A crew of burly, ash-stained engineers stood at the heavy iron winches, their muscles straining against the gears as they held the massive platform steady against the howling wind. "My prince, Lady Adora!" the head engineer shouted over the whistling gale, bowing his head quickly as the two approached the edge. "The vanguard is already assembling in the passes below. The lift is secured and ready for your descent." Rian stepped onto the solid timber of the platform, the wood vibrating slightly beneath his boots from the sheer tension of the chains above. He walked to the forward rim, looking down into the deep, shadow-drenched chasm where the fires of the Nostrudor vanguard flickered like a sea of fallen stars. His stomach tightened. Somewhere, buried beneath the fractures of his mind, he remembered standing here as a child, gripping someone's hand because he had been terrified of the drop. The memory vanished before he could see whose hand it was. Adora stepped up right beside him, her bow blade held tightly in her grip, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the dark storm of the coming war was gathering. She caught the eye of the head engineer and gave a sharp, decisive nod. "Lower us down," she commanded. With a deafening metallic shriek that echoed off the canyon walls, the winches turned, the heavy chains slackened, and the massive Pillar of Calum began its smooth, terrifying descent into the dark abyss below. The wind shrieked louder as the platform plunged deeper into the chasm, the tiered fires of Mount Calum slowly retreating into the sky above them, like a fading constellation. Surrounded by nothing but the groaning of the massive chains and the whistling dark, Rian leaned against the iron guardrail, his eyes fixed on the distant, flickering vanguard below. "Once we hit the ground, what's the strategy?" Rian asked, his voice raised slightly to cut through the gale. "We can't fight a war of attrition. Calum is strong, but the armies of the south can't hold the lowlands forever. We need a swift end." Adora didn't answer right away. She kept her gaze locked on the horizon, her fingers tapping a tense, rhythmic beat against the limb of her bow blade. The orange light of the distant campfires caught the sharp, heavy conflict in her eyes. "A conventional victory isn't an option, Rian," she said, her voice dropping into a somber register that made the wind feel even colder. "We can break their front lines, we can hold the passes, but as long as the Inimicus keep rising, Zarek's remnants will just keep marching. They don't tire. They don't bleed out." "Then we cut off the head," Rian said, his hand instinctively dropping to the hilt of his sword. "Zarek is dead. I drove the blade through him myself. The command structure should be shattered." Adora finally turned to look at him, her expression grim beneath the starlight. She hesitated, her lips parting before she closed them again, clearly reluctant to speak the words aloud. "Zarek was just the vessel, Rian," she admitted softly, the confession sounding heavy, as if the air itself didn't want to carry it. "There is something else. An ancient malice. An entity that hid in the shadow of his mind, directing his hands and shaping his thoughts." Rian froze, a phantom chill creeping up his spine. The memory of his own body being hijacked, marching toward the platform against his will like a hollow puppet, flashed behind his eyes. The presence I felt in the false city, the thing that took my choice away. "Yes," Adora said, nodding sharply. "It is the source. It is the very thing giving the Inimicus their unnatural life. knitting their shattered forms back together with dark will. If it remains intact, this war will never truly end. It will just find a new puppet. She stepped closer to him, the wind whipping her hair across her face as the platform shuddered against a violent updraft. But if it were to somehow be destroyed, if such a thing is even possible— She let the sentence trail off, searching Rian's face. Then that might do the trick. The Inimicus would collapse into ash, the spell would break. Rian looked down at his sword, the intricate sigil on the hilt reflecting the pale moonlight. How would we kill it? How would we even find its true form? He murmured, his voice tightening with a dark resolve. We don't have to find it, Adora replied, looking back down toward the canyon floor as the platform began to slow, nearing the end of its descent. When the vanguard pushes into the northern passes, when you are seen leading the elves of Eithilgard, the entity will come to collect its prize. You. Rian closed his eyes as the platform shuddered toward the valley floor. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the horrors of his captivity returned with sickening clarity. The phantom voices, the twisted illusions that had rewritten his mind, the agonizing helplessness of feeling his own body obey another will. He had been a prisoner inside his own flesh, hollowed out by something ancient and utterly without mercy. When he opened his eyes again, the watchfires of the waiting host reflected in their dark depths. He looked at Adora. Something like that, he said quietly. It doesn't simply exist. The chains groaned overhead. It has a name. He watched her expression carefully. Doesn't it? His voice hardened. What is it called, Adora? Does it have a name? The fierce warrior who had braved the frosts of the north and faced down the Inimicus suddenly seemed to shrink. A visible tremor passed through Adora's shoulders, and her fierce gaze fractured, looking away as if pronouncing the word aloud might summon it from the dark. She swallowed hard, a tiny, terrified whimper escaping her throat before she could catch it. Umbara, she whispered.